Now I'd like to introduce our speaker here. This is Phillip Duncan, a doctoral candidate in the Department of Linguistics, whose research has included work in morphology, syntax, and socio-cultural linguistics. His dissertation investigates verb and clausal structures in MIFA, and his work also includes two Mayan languages from Guatemala, Cachiquel and Quiche. Today's presentation is titled Patterns of Case Agreement in MIFA. Without further ado, Phil Duncan. Thanks.
I appreciate everybody being here, given that it's the last day before stop day, and with such an enticing title for non-linguists, I'm sure everyone's really excited. But also it's nice to return to this department, although I've been in the Department of Linguistics ever since I've been here. I was actually supported with a FLAS fellowship to study Cachiquel a few years ago, and that kickstarted several other projects, the ones on Cachiquel and Quiche that Aaron just mentioned. So I'm going to talk about patterns of case and agreement in MAPA. I have to apologize for one thing. I'm trying to learn how to use LaTeX, which compiles programs, if you don't know what that is. But there's a special character. Let's see if this is not supposed to be an apostrophe. You guys probably don't care, but just in case anybody does know about this language, MAPA, it should be a different character, but I worked really hard and couldn't get it to work on this presentation. But I do want to thank, before we begin, the speakers that I've all worked with, good friends and acquaintances that I've met over the year who have helped me immensely in sharing their language and or putting up with me, because it's not, although I think it's fun, it's not always easy for somebody to be asking you, how do you say this? And by the way, if I do this weird thing with your language that no human being would normally think about, what do you think about it? And also thanks, even though he's not here anymore, to Peter Haney for extending the invitation to present here in the first place. All right. So by way of introduction, since some of this gets kind of linguistic-y, and I guess I imagine, I try not to be so linguistic-y. Does anybody have a background or have had some classes in linguistics? Okay. Okay, great. So if I say something and you just are completely lost at some point, just let me know and I'm happy to explain it. You can interrupt me at any time and just ask questions. But I thought I'd start with why study indigenous languages and why study indigenous Latin American languages when you have 7,000 plus human languages to choose from. Why choose from this particular area? There's a multitude of reasons, and I don't intend to be exhaustive. In terms of why you would want to investigate an indigenous language, usually these are endangered and underrepresented. I typically start with they have inherent value in and of themselves, and they're terribly interesting in and of themselves. But also, whether it's just from a broad human perspective or even in terms of understanding within a discipline like linguistics, we have this terrible need for diversity. If all of our theory of linguistics is based on English and Japanese, not that there's anything bad about those languages, we're going to come really shorthanded. So think if any discipline like biology, if you said you were going to be studying trees and you decided to focus on two species of trees and nothing else, or two species of some animal and nothing else, and you didn't really focus on all the other diversity that exists, you wouldn't really have a complete picture. MAPA just helps to complete that picture a little bit better, basically. And also it helps contribute to our understanding of human knowledge. In particular, how does language work? How do human languages work? Not just specific languages, but can we actually gain insight into languages on the wholesale? Now, I have bought into a particular way of looking at language that not all linguists hold. It's pretty common in our department that underlyingly a lot of languages end up being structurally similar. That on the surface we see this immense amount of diversity, and typically when you learn a new language, you're struck with that diversity, then I can't believe how different this is in the language I speak. But oftentimes what linguists have revealed over the last decades is that they're built from actually really, really similar structures, potentially. And then we can do a lot of cross-linguistic investigations, and sometimes looking at one language that's totally unrelated can actually help out in understanding these other languages. And this requires evidence from a large variety of languages. And like I said earlier, MAPA is sort of a way to help increase that variety. And Latin American languages have a history of contributions to both descriptive and theoretical linguistics. So some highlights, and I kind of am biased to ones that are interesting in my field. Mayan languages, for example, are known for having ergative agreement and potentially ergative case. And for people who are only studying Indo-European languages like English and German and so forth, all of a sudden they come across these new languages that are ergative, and it's kind of weird from an Anglocentric perspective. And so people had to think, does this mean we have to rethink the architectures that we understand language? Are these similar, so on and so forth? And Mayan languages and a lot of other languages have had a key role in understanding what we know about ergativity today. Likewise, things we call extraction asymmetries, so technical term, but basically sometimes when you ask a question like who ate the rice or what did you eat, sometimes languages don't just let you freely ask questions like that. You have to do something special. And a lot of languages, several languages from Latin America have helped our understanding of what is going on and what we need to understand that. Also, word order possibilities. So famously, Hishkariana was the first documented object initial language. And some linguists prior to that didn't know that, even though it was a logical possibility that you could have a sentence begin with the object, people hadn't seen it until about the 1950s or so. And then nowadays there's a lot of work, again, kind of centered on Mayan languages that's looking at, well, there's a lot of languages in this area that begin with a verb and that are very verb-centric. And, you know, how do we understand how these structures are actually built? And Maypa is going to, I think, contribute to some of these as well. It has a lot of potential. So why Maypa? In case anybody's interested, I mean, to be honest, I got started working in this language because I had friends that all spoke the language. I worked at a restaurant for years with everybody that was all from this same part of Guerrero, Mexico. And we would have a lot of conversations, and they would sort of teach me some of their phrases. And I was starting to learn a little bit. I'm not a speaker by any means. But when I became, when I went back to do my undergrad in linguistics, I had to do a project. And I just asked one of my friends, hey, would you mind helping me with this? And that just kick-started my interest in this language. And I've been working on it for about 5 or 6 years in total now. But there's not a lot of linguistic literature that exists on the language. There's some great work by native speaker linguists in terms of documenting several properties and other non-native speaker linguists as well. But there's absolutely no syntactic analyses out there. I mean, I have a master's thesis that I did on indefinite pronouns. It's the closest thing to syntax that you get on the language, and I wouldn't even really say that it's that strongly syntactic. But also, typologically, it's known to have some really exceptional properties. So it has a unique way of encoding a given new distinction. Some languages like to change something about the sentence whenever you're talking about a new referent. And Maypa does this in several ways. Sometimes the suffix changes, and sometimes it's actually just a slight tonal inflection that tells you that you're dealing with a new referent. So it's a little bit complicated and unique in that sense. Also, its indefinite pronoun system is based from the numeral 1, which is kind of a rare thing cross-linguistically. I've got question marks on these other things. So one of the scholars who's done a lot of work on a particular variety of Maypa, that's not the one that I study, argues that the language has this special case, which is, a case is kind of a way to talk about grammatical relations. And he says it's the only human language that has this thing called pegative case. And also, it has special properties about which arguments it likes to mark. I kind of disagree with him, and that's why I've got these question marks here. I think he's wrong about some of these things, but I won't get into that. But what's going to be relevant for our talk today is extreme morphological complexity in verbal agreement. So by verbal agreement, basically I mean something like, in English, for example, if you say, she reads the book, the verb read agrees with the subject in number. So we don't have gender agreement in English, we have number agreement, and that's pretty much it. So I read, you read, but then she, he, it reads, or whatever. And that's the kind of thing that I'm going to be talking about, although it's a little bit more complex than that. So Ottoman languages, of which Maypa is one, have a bit of a reputation for morphological complexity. I apologize for this crazy long quote, but I go back to this when I'm struggling with trying to understand anything about this language. This is actually a strange source of comfort for me. So some earlier authors wrote, perhaps the most conspicuous hallmark of the Ottoman family is the overwhelming complexity it presents to descriptive analysis. What's more, the complexity which one finds is not a mere superficial phenomenon which results from the interaction of underlying generalizations of great descriptive power, but rather a seemingly intractable maze of irregularities which lead the analyst to question his own ability to analyze, and which has led some of us to reevaluate the relative importance of rule-governed behavior versus arbitrary memorized facts in human knowledge. So modern linguistics, especially what we call modern generative linguistics, if you know that, is built on the idea that language is rule-governed and systematic. So if you come across a language that might not be rule-governed and systematic, you'd better pay attention. But surprisingly, not a lot of people have given terrible attention to Mei-Pa, although some Automagian languages have a lot of documentation. So another reason why Mei-Pa is important because of this complexity is because verbs are so key to understanding this complexity and figuring out how it manifests. So I love, so the guy who I said I thought he was not correct about some of these other things, but his work is fantastic, has claimed, and he comes up with this great word to describe Mei-Pa, that it exhibits omniverbity, which is to say that like basically everything is a verb in the language. When you come across pronouns, they look like certain verbs. And he actually argues that they are some sort of like existential predicate that's marked with an agreement marker. Nouns, the possessive paradigm looks like verbal inflection in a dative construction. Coordinators, words like with and, also take these agreement markers. And so there's a lot of things that look like verbs. Yet they exhibit, from the analyst's perspective, bewildering complexity. Obviously, children are acquiring it, simplistically. So it's not that this is something that's just from the person who's outside trying to look in and figure the system out. And Mark Weathers and Abad Carrasco Zuniga. So Abad is one of the native speaker linguists who has done decades of work on this language. That's fantastic. In one of the only grammars that exist on the language, call verbs the most complicated part of all the grammar. And basically, this means that it's not easy to analyze these verbs. Okay, sorry for my dorky reference there. All right, so let me just illustrate what I mean by that. So these are all different verbs that have you as either the subject or the object. And if you notice that in A, natamahu, no, is there any Mei-Pa speakers in here? Good, okay. Then I have to apologize a little less profusely about mispronouncing things. But we have natamahu, and ta means you, basically. You're pushing me. You're laughing, we also see ta. Okay, so things look not that bad. You get over here to you're jumping, nakishi, and I, that suffix, that's what means you. And over here, I woke you, where you is the object, nishikashi, we get the same thing. So it looks like we've got a little bit of some patterns here going on. But then you get to you died, and you got nga, and it's the ah that encodes you. And then over here you arrived, ni janu, and it's the ja part of the verb that means you. So it looks like we've got several ways just to encode you on a verb. And that's part of the complexity. Now I should note there's potentially 40 or more tonal classes of verbs in the language that no one, including me, understands right now. And those actually don't factor. I'm not looking at those tonal classes, but right now I'm just going to be looking at these patterns of agreement. So this is part of why Automagian languages like Mei-Pa have this hallmark of complexity. So the question is, how do you account for it? Suarez, one of the earliest people to write a long work, grammatical work on this, basically said, there's 12 classes of verbs, and that's as far as I'm going to go. 12 arbitrary classes. That's great in terms of helping us to describe the patterns, but it doesn't really say why the patterns exist. And likewise, again, what might this tell us about how language works in general? Ideally, you don't have to rewrite the whole playbook. Ideally, you're going to broaden our understanding of what's possible, maybe refine it a little bit, but it's still going to fall within the confines of what we know, unless we have to throw everything out. So what I'm going to look at is basically what these patterns of agreement tell us about a few things, if we have time, and depending on how much you can sustain some syntactic analyses, which I think is terribly exciting, but I have to admit that not everybody does. So one is this understanding of this phenomenon called ergativity. And if you don't know what that is, I will hopefully give a clear definition of what it is and how it manifests in language. So ergativity has been studied in linguistic literature for 40 or more years, heavily. But still, there's mystery. It's mysterious. And aspects about it are unknown. Likewise, how the syntactic structures underlie verbs. So the weird view is that the words are actually composed of sentences. That's sort of a backwards way of looking at it. I think intuitively you might come to think that sentences are built of words, but what I'm going to argue is that these words are actually built of small sentences. And then how agreement then maps onto these, what we call architectures, basically just structures. And I'll show you how we visualize that if you're not too familiar. So any questions so far, or no? Okay. So Mappa is part of the Ottoman family, and here you have contemporary Ottoman languages distributed primarily in central and southern Mexico. So you see some of the larger ones like Otomi, and then we've got Mixtec as well, number 10 down here. And this is the state of Guerrero, and right here in this, I guess you would call that an ochre color maybe. 13, that's Mappa. It also goes by the name Tlapanec or Tlapaneco. Basically, Tlapanec is what we call, it's an exonym. It's not a name that's indigenous to the people, but it was actually given by Nahuatl speakers. And Mappa basically means a person who is from Appa. And the word for Appa in Nahuatl is Tlapa. So Tlapanec is basically a literal translation of the word that Mappa speakers used in their own language to refer to themselves. And that's part of the reason why I always use Mappa rather than typically Tlapanec. There's about 9 varieties that are recognized and about 100,000 speakers total among all of the different varieties. And this is actually one of these rare cases of sort of successful revitalization. So linguists working for decades in this area, but when they first started writing about it in the 70s, you saw these numbers were like less than half of this. So there's a lot of, it's very complex, but there's a lot of cultural revitalization. There's a lot of linguistic revitalization happening in the communities. Most speakers, I've never met a Mappa monolingual speaker. Most of them are bilingual, usually Spanish is the second language. But you find other cases where they speak a combination of the indigenous languages that are near, geographically close. But there's a lot of bilingualism. And a lot of the speakers that I work with also had very different experiences in education. So their educational experience was typically what we call subtractive bilingualism, where you might learn a little bit of your own language so that they can get you to teach this other language and eventually not speak the first language. So that's something that nowadays most people are not typically advocates of, at least in the linguistic and educational world. All right, so these are also associated with geographical centers. That's what you have in the parentheses over here. And then the variety that I speak, or that I study, is sometimes referred to as Mappa Manyu'i, and it's from, this is called Malinaltepec Mappa. But as I mentioned, Malinaltepec is kind of over here in this dark blue region that you see here. That's actually where Iliatenco is, or Mishtunui. And those are the speakers that I work with all come from this, this area here. And, excuse me, one of the reasons it's important to control for that is because there are pretty drastic differences among these varieties, and so I've tried to not have to deal with all those differences at the same time. All right, so it is a little bit different than Mappa Manyu'i or Malinaltepec Mappa. The speakers that I've worked with are all, as I mentioned, bi or trilingual, either English or another indigenous language is the third language. And the data that I get primarily comes from elicitation techniques. So either structured elicitation, which is essentially me coming with a list of things that I'm hoping to investigate and saying, how do you say this? How do you say this? Sort of to break the monotony and also to elicit semi-natural discourse. I also elicit through prompted narratives. So could you tell me about a time when, whatever, fill in the blank, and then just have them speak freely. I don't have any conversational data, probably because for practical reasons, it ends up being very difficult to get a lot of people in the same place at the same time. And the people that I work with, by coincidence, their spouses don't speak Mappa. Their spouses either speak Mixtec or Nahuatl. And so it's a little bit difficult to do that in the house. And another way to do it is use these things called story builder cards, which are not that well known in the linguistic world. They're actually devised as part of an undergraduate honors program in, I think, British Columbia. But basically you have these action cards and character cards, and then you just put them together and have the speaker create a story based on that. So why this is important is because the language of elicitation is primarily Spanish. And Spanish has radically different properties, and what you don't really want happening is them to basically literally translate what you're asking for in Spanish. And so it's important to basically take steps to ensure that that doesn't happen. All right, did I skip? Okay. So some grammatical features of the language, it's tonal. So I'm sure everybody is familiar with Chinese as being a tonal language. And Meipa has tonal contrast as well. And also what we call tone sandy. So when you put things together, strange things happen basically. The word order is verb initial, but it allows for verb object subject or verb subject object. And then you get arguments that are indexed on the verb via these agreement morphemes and what we call clitics, that it's kind of like not quite an affix, but not quite a full word. And then there's no what we call case marking on dependence. So some of these, if it doesn't matter too much, the main thing is this argument indexing. And so everybody knows, since we're going to see several verbs, this is kind of what a verb looks like in Meipa. The root is surrounded by affixal material, either agreement morphemes or negation. Just to be simple, I didn't include any negative forms, I don't think, in this presentation. And then Meipa is an aspectual language, so rather than using tense to encode temporal reference, it actually includes just aspect, which you'll see glossed as PFV or IPFE, which means perfective or imperfective. It kind of has to do a little bit with sort of whether the action is finished or complete. And we'll see a lot of verbs, so hopefully this won't be too bad. All right, so as I mentioned, the agreement is pretty complex. And I also mentioned that Suarez tried to account for this by saying basically if you look at the suffixes, you get 12 different groups. But one thing that's really important to note is that agreement actually doesn't just occur as a suffix. It occurs on the left side of the verb and the right side of the verb, and potentially there's agreement inside the verb. Now these were all things that Suarez knew about. It's not like this is something he didn't know, but he didn't factor into how he created these classes, basically. In my opinion, if you only look at that suffix, you're gonna come up with the wrong generalizations, because you're gonna fail to see how certain verbs actually pattern together in really important ways. And then Wickman basically claims that these are case markers, and I won't really, the title said patterns of case and agreement Meipa, and I kept that since it was the original, but I figured case is really, this is already real complex for non-linguists, so I'm just not going to talk too much about case. But I will say that according to a lot of theoretical linguistics, case doesn't actually get marked on the verb. So if he's right, this would be another very typological exceptional property for Meipa, that usually when you see case marking, it occurs on the things that the verb agrees with. So in English, for example, you have, she ate the cake, and, I saw her. And the form of the pronoun is got case, either accusative case as the doer of the action, or, either nominative case as the doer of the action, or accusative case as the recipient of the action. So Meipa doesn't do that kind of thing, and it would be a little bit weird, possibly, if it was case. For verbs where you see agreement surfacing on the left side, the second singular and plural arguments are the most salient, so that's why I started out with the you forms. And then the first singular is indicated by a tonal pattern. It's really hard to see because of the complex tone sandy and all these really complex patterns of tonal classes, potentially. And then the third singular sometimes is encoded by what we call a glottal stop. And that's the thing that I mentioned. I've got it as apostrophe, but it shouldn't be an apostrophe. And if you don't know what a glottal stop is, in the word uh-oh, that catch in between the sound and the o sound, that's a glottal stop. So we do have these in English. And then sometimes, though, you see third singular happening post-verbally. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go through an array of verb types, and hopefully we won't all get overwhelmed with data. So the main thing that I want everybody to focus on is, given a type of clause, transitive, intransitive, and so on and so forth, where does the agreement happen and what shape does it take? I'm sort of like leading you into the conclusion. I wouldn't normally do that, but since this is going to be a lot to take in, I'm just going to point that out from the outset. So on a transitive verb that does not have object suppletion, agreement occurs on the left and right side. So we saw nitashkashi iki, you woke them. You've got you on the left, and this encodes them on the right. So you actually don't need iki here. You can drop that, and you've still got all the information that you need. Or y'all are waking me. You've got nu, which is the aspect, but it also encodes that there's a subject that's more than one. Which encodes me, and then la, which encodes it's you all. Okay, so does that make sense? Everybody? These affixes here and here have to stay on the verb. But the reason I've got this equal sign is that that signals what we call a clitic, and there are some things that you can actually insert between the verb and the clitic. They're rare, but that means it doesn't always have to be in the same place. They're a bit different status. I'm not going to talk about clitics, just again to sort of simplify things. All right, one of the types of intransitive verbs are something that we call unergatives. Unergatives are typically an intransitive verb that basically has sort of an agentive flair to it, so the person actually is like volitionally doing the action. That's a bit simplistic, but I think it gets us kind of far. And you see agreement only on the left side of the verb root, except for these clitics. So, so you've got the glottal stop encoding she. This one's a little bit weird, though, because you've got this suffix also encoding the she as well. So this is the weird case. If anybody really wants to know what's going on, I'll try and give you my take on it. And it might be weird that I put an object in an intransitive, but unergatives are a special class that cross-linguistically take what we call cognate objects. So normally you say, I dreamed or I slept. And so you have a verb and you have one person involved in the event. But you can say something like, I slept a wonderful sleep, or I slept a beautiful sleep. I dreamed a beautiful dream. So you can put an object there as long as it's cognate with the verb. You can't say, I slept a beautiful nap. That sounds kind of weird, right? So these are a special class of verbs we call unergatives. All right, other ones that we call inchoatives, which is basically sort of like receiving an action that isn't overtly caused. Statives, so being in a state of something, and experiencer verbs like being sick, for example, being hungry, getting tired. So notice that 5a and b, so all of these are suffixes, but I got cut, or I cut myself on accident, looks a lot like I'm alone. And essentially they are the same. Those differences, I would argue, aren't going to be relevant. The vowel length here and the tone, even though those are critical in the language, here that's not marking a critical difference. Versus ngo, I'm sick, or sometimes this can mean I died, depending on how you use it. But basically you've got these suffixes on the right side of the verb. With ditransitives, so these are verbs kind of like give, you basically have the suffix over here that is going to encode one of either the person that you're giving something to or the thing that you're giving. But the thing that you're giving has to be animate in order for it to work. So we've got that here. And also you do, like, so if this were a second singular, you'd see ta over here. So it would look like that. Then you've also got these what we call verbs of motion and appearance, like arrive. And notice that this is what we call suppletion. So suppletion you're all familiar with because you do it all the time, but you might not be used to talking about it. So when you say I go to the store every day, and then in the past you don't say I goed to the store, you say I went to the store. So all of a sudden you have to use a form of the verb that's totally unrelated. Same phenomenon is happening here, that by and large this is not explainable by other means. It's just a completely different form of the verb for whatever reason. And it only happens on a specific set of verbs. This also can happen for objects as long as it's a transitive verb that indicates either motion or position. So if you want to say I carry something, it literally means I go, this sentence literally means I go carrying a banana. But notice that this verb here, hayo, is only if banana is one. Now, banana doesn't get marked for plural because in this language, inanimates don't get marked for plurals overtly. But if you say I brought two bananas, the verb, which is actually really either just the sound ya or yo, gets changed to ga. So again, totally unrelated change, and it's predictable based on the object. And it's not the subject that does this. So if you have plural subject, we arrived carrying a banana, you get it marked over here, you get it on this aspect here, but you don't get it triggered by this. You actually get it just by the object here. All right, so summing all that up. Basically, we have all of these different classes based on where the agreement shows up and what type of clause it is. I'm not going to rehash this because this is pretty much essentially what we just walked through. But the key observation that I trying to make is that the agreement classes are based on where they appear on the verb and the form that they take. That is, are they pronounced the same, basically? So for an object of a normal transitive, if it's you, it's I. But if it's the subject of a transitive, it's going to be pronounced ta, for example. That's what I mean by where they appear and what form they take. Okay? All right. And clause type is really, really relevant. I won't get into too much, but it's going to be important for the structure. And so a hypothesis is that basically your agreement morpheme indicates something about the underlying structure in a way that languages don't typically do. But in a way that's not necessarily surprising given that we know about the structure of languages cross-linguistically. Okay? So on the one hand, I'm going to give a typological account. This would probably be the most useful if anybody has interest in these kind of things, since this is the less syntactic-y of it. So if we have to, we'll speed through the other part. But one way that people have talked about ergativity for a long time is to say that we basically find different alignment types if we're given a transitive event. So here, S is a term for subject that specifically refers to a subject of an intransitive verb, like I dreamed. The A refers to an agent, which is the subject of a transitive verb, like I ate the cake. And the P refers to the object. So these are just a traditional way of doing it in linguistics, but it helps us to differentiate between these two things that in English we typically call subjects. Because in English, which is an accusative language, if you say she slept and she ate the cake, she gets pronounced the same way. But if it's an object, it gets pronounced differently. I saw her. So we have she, her. What happens in Mei-Pa and a lot of other ergative languages would be that rather than these two things patterning together, the intransitive subject and the object do. So if English were ergative, it would sound like this. She ate the cake, I saw her, her slept. So that would be the way that it would sound if English, like we have a hypothetical language that's ergative. Tripartite languages mark them all differently. So to use a pronoun that's been proposed for different reasons, but if you take "je" as another option, another possibility of a pronoun in English, then it would be she ate the cake, I saw her, je slept. So all three would be different. Okay, that's a tripartite language. In neutral, you would use the same thing for everything. So this language would look like she ate the cake, she slept, I saw she. It would just never change. Okay, and Mei-Pa basically exhibits 3 of these alignments. Now, a lot of languages exhibit 2. I don't know a lot that exhibit 3, and it basically depends on what verbs that you compare. For example, if you look at 11a and b and c, you get the object and the intransitive subject patterning together, and then the transitive subject different. That's exactly what we have here. But if you look at these two, all of a sudden it looks like English. And if you look at A and C and E, they're all different. So all of a sudden it's tripartite. So what's the system? And it looks like this is a split based on clause type. And this is really expected. It may seem weird if you're not familiar with it, but one thing that's been known about ergative languages for a long time is that they're rarely consistently ergative. And there's a claim recently that there's no such thing as an ergative language because of this, but only ergative systems. But another way of thinking about ergativity comes from Amy Rhodes Steele's work, where basically you've got 3 different properties based on some way that grammatically the language deals with these different things. So if subjects of transitive behave different from subjects of intransitives, then you've got the ergativity property. The absolutive is that objects of transitives and subjects of transitives pattern together, and for Mei-Pa this is all agreement. And then the argument structural is that some intransitive verbs look different. And if you look at it through that lens, Mei-Pa is always ergative. So potentially new insight into what it means for a language to be ergative cross-linguistically, because all 3 of these properties coalesce. So in terms of alignment, you've got a split. In terms of ergativity properties, you're ergative through and through. So the next question is then why does it possess all these 3 properties? But it looks like we're running pretty close to out of time, so I'm not going to get into this. But the basic account that I argue for is that it's structural. So in syntax, something like this is a visual representation of the cognitive models that we use to produce phrases and sentences. And then you've got, in a transitive verb, you have both a subject and an object. And they're in specific sites in this particular architecture. If you really want to know like how we diagnose these things, I'm happy to get into that. But then intransitive verbs look differently because you've got unergatives that have just what we call the external argument, and something that's just an internal argument. So something that looks like a transitive subject, something that looks like a transitive object structurally, okay? I'm going to skip through some of this stuff because we're running out of time. What time should we end, I guess?
Normally we, like 40 minutes.
Okay.
I mean 30 to 40 minutes.
Okay, then I'll wrap it up so that we don't. But the basic idea is that if you actually think about these agreement patterns as mapping onto structure, you make the right predictions and when you get the agreement markers. So the thing that always ends up being, say, for second singular, that gets pronounced ta, and it appears on the left edge of the verb, only occurs for transitive subjects and unergatives. That structurally should be in the highest spot in this phrase that I had back here. Sorry, specifier of voice phrase. And here. But other things pattern together differently with distinct structures underlying them as well. So if you have the argument that sits right next to the verb root, then it's going to either be an object or a transitive, or an inchoative or a stative. And then there's some other ones as well. But it looks like what MAPA does is, rather than take a system like, say, Mayan, which is also an ergative language, but when you have a choice to insert an agreement marker, you only have two classes. And so you're going to get what looks like a simpler system on the surface because you have to choose between something that's called the ergative and something that's called the absolutive. No matter what the structure is, you got to put one of them in there. What MAPA seems to do differently is every time you get a different structure, you get a different agreement morpheme, basically. And so that's actually very straightforward. It's surprisingly straightforward. It's just that languages, for whatever reason, don't seem to do it like that. So it looks like we've got potentially an explanation for some of this rich complexity, that it's all these ergativity properties coming together, and the agreement is really, really, really sensitive to the underlying structure. And then MAPA looks so different because rather than having a many to few relationship between underlying structures and agreement classes, you've got a many-to-many relationship, which for whatever reason just isn't found across the world's languages. So other languages from which this other architecture that I showed you but didn't really talk about then feed into our understanding of MAPA, because we don't actually need a new structure to account for MAPA. We can use existing structures that have been attested cross-linguistically, and MAPA looks like it fits within that system roughly, but it gives us a broader understanding of what's possible within that system because we don't typically see agreement systems working like this. And it also showcases what it might mean to be ergative, how argument structure works syntactically, and also maybe how agreement works as well. Anyway, I'll go ahead and wrap up there. Thanks for everybody for putting up with all the syntax.
I had a question. How did you choose the language, the particular variety and?
Well, it was really just chance. I mean, by the most part, so I know a couple of speakers who speak different varieties, but once I began working with several speakers who were friends of mine, like I said, I worked at a restaurant with several people, and then originally I was actually started working with friends and coworkers, but some of them have left. One of my friends passed away several years ago, and so I now work with people that it's sort of a different group that I know more by acquaintance and through this work.
But when you say working at a restaurant, where?
Chipotle.
Oh my God.
I know. I should get them to sponsor my research. No, no. Yeah, and everybody, it just, in Lawrence, I mean, I don't know if everybody knows, but there's a little bit of a microcosm of Guerrero. We have speakers of Maypal, we have speakers of Mixtec, we have speakers of Nahuatl, just all around. So it's amazing to see how linguistically rich and diverse Lawrence is in terms of indigenous languages of Latin America. And you see, from my friend's perspective, it's sort of accidental that they ended up here. They knew somebody, they had a family member, and that's why they came to Lawrence in particular. But that's how I got into it. Yeah.
Have you been down to Guerrero?
I have not been to Guerrero. I've been to several other places. In fact, I just got back from the Yucatan for a conference presenting on Mayan languages. But I work with distance for people that are actually in the state, and then locally with people that are here. Yeah.
I had a question.
Sure.
You said something about story cards and how if presented in another way, you're trying to get data sets. If you were to tell them to say something in their language, they might verbatim repeat it in, if I understand right, a syntactic way that matches Spanish, their own language.
Yeah.
So that's kind of that kind of segues into another question. But that's a way to get correct sentences that are grammatically correct in their own language.
Yeah. Well, in the worst case scenario, you would ask for something because a lot of people have found that do structural elicitation learn that speakers are really, really polite. And especially at first, they will kind of just like say, oftentimes just out of politeness, will give you a structure that might not be ungrammatical, but it might not be a natural way to say it. And so what I was worried about is that, so MAPA is verb initial, but it also does have subject, verb, object, word order, but usually under certain circumstances. So a lot of times if you're asking for an SVO sentence, I wanted to make sure that I would get back not just an SVO sentence because that's what I asked for. And so that's what some of these other things help, is that if you get longer stretches of text and talk, you might be able to see that some of these word order facts interact with information structure. So the subject is first because it's the topic of what's being discussed, rather than it's an artifact of what language I asked it in it. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, I mean, so it's hard to know whether or not you'd get something necessarily ungrammatical, especially working with a speaker. Usually, like, you establish a relationship and you kind of they kind of know how to make those types of judgments. But mainly, I just wanted something that was a little bit more natural, like something that they would actually say in regular conversation. But some of that is actually, and you have to be aware, it's just an artifact, not just the language that you're working in, but the methodology. So if I say, how do you say Mary wrote the book? And then I'll get a subject, verb, object, word order. Why? Because we hadn't been talking about Mary before. So the first thing that somebody would do is give you the new information in the first part of the sentence. And then if I ask, well, how do you say Peter wrote the book? Well, I'm going to get the same order because Peter's a new referent. But if I keep talking about Mary, then things seem to change. Yeah.
I kind of have a follow-up question. You said that the language has been in a resurgence, it's been growing and everything from, you said less than...
I remember seeing numbers that were lower than, I think, 60,000, maybe even lower than 50,000 around the 1970s-ish.
And it's grown to over 100,000. And then you said that very few of them are monolingual or bilingual in Spanish primarily.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of features have you seen that grown into...
Sort of the mixing?
Yeah.
It's hard to say in terms of the grammatical features. And the reason being is because the language is so little documented, and most of the documentation has occurred at a point that there's already been so much extensive contact that some of the deeper grammatical aspects, it's going to be a long time before we know.
Mm-hmm.
But there's definitely a lot of lexical borrowing. So I mean, that kind of thing that you would expect. And kind of like you see in other, for whatever reason, when Spanish went across the globe, a lot of the indigenous languages that had contact with that seemed to borrow what we call discourse markers, like pues or entonces, that kind of thing, and those also kind of creep up. Sometimes conjunctions, so sometimes functional words like and. But I've not, other than sometimes if I'm working with a speaker and I ask some really out there word that you might not, like just a native speaker might not ever say, sometimes they'll give me a word in Spanish, and just have to figure that kind of stuff out too. Yeah. But overall, the grammatical structures, they look very, very different than Spanish on the whole. I mean, so it seems like at least there's still a good deal of separation. I do know that one of my speakers' parents are monolingual, because when she calls her parents all the time and she only speaks to them in Nepal, she says they don't understand much Spanish at all. So there are some monolinguals, but kind of feel bad. Hey, do you mind if I talk to your parents or something? No, so I've just never met any here, and even a lot of people down there end up being bilingual as well. Were you going to ask a question too?
Oh, yeah. So is the tonal sandhi, is that affected by other tonemes or phonemes or both?
Well, probably both. I mean, so what's hard about verbs is that verbs could be as little as just a single consonant, but it bears tone in some way. But verb roots, unlike English or Spanish that sort of have a citation form that's usually what we call infinitive, there is no citation form that exists independently of everything else. So you will never come across a verb that's not inflected. And so it's hard to really find out what the underlying tone actually is. So it seems to be influenced by just like adjacent words, but also potentially some of these agreement affixes and the ways that they combine to create particular tonal melodies. I mean, it's always one of those things that I'm fascinated with, but I just haven't looked at, and partly because my background's not in phonetics, and so I know like pieces about it, but it's one of those things that I really hope somebody picks up and does some work on it. Could be you. No.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, and I just want to remind you about the Christmas party tomorrow. Dedicated to La Guadalupana, and we're gonna have food. So I know it's that day, but if you guys are hungry at 3:30, come and check it out. Gracias.